we've become very romantic about transfers of power from time to time, well, on a regular basis. I'm not so sure we should just settle, right, and think that we've got it all figured out. America's still a relatively young country.
Let's go.
Welcome to Citizen. We got a special guest today, Will Kingston, host of the Fire at Will podcast. Don't take that literally. And also a contributor at The Spectator, from The Spectator, and a contributor at Sky News. You were an Aussie in London. How's that work?
I'm surviving. London has a bit of a feel of a decaying empire at the moment. But look, my one hope for London is that it has reinvented itself many times throughout its history, and I hope that there is one more reinvention left, because I think maybe similar to New York in a way, it's one of those big global cities that is feeling the effects of some pretty awful liberal policies that have attacked the foundations of the culture for the last 20 or 30 years.
Okay, so let's go back a little bit. What part of Australia you're from?
I'm from Sydney.
Sydney. So that would be like it's Australia is a big country, like the U.S. is a big country, and I don't mean to say that they're similar sized or anything, but there are very disparate styles and cultures depending on where you are in the country. That isn't true for a lot of non-U.S. places, to be frank, right? Like in Asia, you'll often have city and hinterland. In Europe, you have some of that, a little bit of that. There's a lot of gypsies still running around there and shit like that. But Australia, it can get wildly different, both culturally and politically, depending on where you are in the country, right?
Yes, I think the same trend is playing out in Australia as it is in the US and the UK, in that the big difference now is between city and regional, or city and rural areas. I think you'd find that in the wealthier parts of Sydney, they'd be more culturally similar to New York than they would be to the inland country areas of Australia. And similarly, if you went to Middletown, Ohio, it'd be more similar to the rural parts of Australia than it would be to California. Like this is the same thing in London compared to the north of England. Like there's this really interesting trend that is, I think it started in the US, and globalization has just pushed it out to countries like Australia and the United Kingdom, where these countries are just being divided along city and regional lines. And then you get the culture wars that come along with that division. So I think, if you're living you'd see a lot of similarities as an American, and then looking at the way that Australia is slowly splintering.
And I mean, maybe this has always happened this way, right? I mean, if you think about just human history and government in human history, typically speaking, the wealthier people would reach out into the hinterland to try to extract labor and wealth from people, and obviously that creates some kind of animosity between the two groups, particularly when it's in a class system, which has been the case usually throughout history. I think there was a period of time where we moved beyond the idea of class or caste systems in the West for the most part, but it does seem like it's reforming itself but mostly in the political class, to be honest, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, it is. Well, I was listening to a really interesting conversation the other day with Bharti Ranga Sargon, who wrote a really good book.
Yeah, she's a good friend of mine. I love that.
Is she?
Love that
Great. We had her on the podcast the other day, but she was saying that real wages peaked in the US relative to GDP, I think in like 1972.
Yeah, it's in the early 70s.
Yeah, in the early 70s. And I would expect, I don't have the data, I would expect something similar in Australia, maybe a bit later. But that really, if you want an answer to why there is this division, I think it comes down to that. Like if you look at the past, there probably was a value exchange where you could kind of go to regional areas and extract labor there. But that value exchange isn't there anymore. And, if you want to know why someone like a JD Vance has been selected as vice president, and if you want to know why Trump's going to win in a landslide in November, you could do worse than just pointing to that data point.
Yeah, for sure. So let's go back to, when did you leave Australia?
4 or 5 years ago.
So post or pre-COVID or during?
just before COVID.
Okay.
Before COVID.
So you didn't get to experience, like, I think Australia got a bit of a reputation for some of the ways they handled that whole situation. And frankly, as someone in the U.S. with our media, it's hard to tell what is reality or not with regard to stuff that happened other places. Do you have any insight on what it was actually like there?
I do. I had to go back a couple of times, and every time you had to go back to Australia during the pandemic, you had to stay in a hotel and quarantine for 14 days, which gives you an insight into just how crazy that situation was. Here's the thing. Australia used to have, I would argue, one of the best reputations of any country in the world. If you're an Australian and you go to the US or you go to London or you go to Asia and you say, "G'day, mate," and you shake someone's hand, you're at an advantage already. It really kind of, you're known as like laid back, good fun, a bit irreverent, bit cheeky. And so when those news stories started coming and out to the world of pregnant mothers being kind of picked up by the police for sitting on a park bench during COVID, or, the draconian measures that you saw, I think the rest of the world was pretty shocked because it just completely was at odds with the traditional Crocodile Dundee reputation of Australia. And I think what it revealed is that whole reputation maybe was always a bit of a charade. The classic point that a lot of people like to make is that Australia was a country descended from convicts, and I often like to say that there was just as many jailers as there were convicts, and unfortunately it's the descendants of jailers that are ones that run Australia. Like, there is this real nanny state instinct that I think now pervades a lot of the country. I think it's got a lot worse. And mate, it breaks my heart. It breaks my heart because I'm a passionate Australian. I think I love what I think Australia used to be, but it isn't like that anymore. And unfortunately, I can't see a path back quite easily.
Yeah, a lot of people on the conservative right in the United States make the connection between the banning of weapons in Australia in the mid-1990s after a mass shooting event and the rise in authoritarianism there over the last, let's say, 25 years. Do you see any distinction there, or is that sampling on something that doesn't really matter? I mean, because the general thinking here in the U.S., and I feel like a lot of global conservatives, especially in the West, feel this way as well, is that 450 million guns is a pretty good let's say, stalwart against certain types of oppression.
I don't think so. I can see why you could make that argument, but guns were never associated with freedom and liberty in the same way that they are in the US. They were actually largely restricted to regional farmers who owned them anyway. You wouldn't have found many people in Sydney or Melbourne who would have owned a gun. So I think they held a very different cultural significance in Australia to the US. But then it does raise the question, well, if not guns, what has led to this? And it's a tough one. Like, I think there is this global kind of cultural trend where people increasingly are prioritizing safety over freedom. And I just wonder, Australia has had it so good for so long, similar ways to the US, that I think a lot of people in a modern generation have kind of forgotten why it's important to argue for things like free speech, to argue for things like individual liberties, because they haven't had to. Our grandparents' generation, had to go into the trenches and fight for that stuff. And Australia, up until COVID, had 27 years of uninterrupted economic growth, the longest period of prosperity of any country in modern history. The things have been good for a long time, and I think that's let a relatively small group of kind of liberal left authoritarians in the universities, who then kind of spread out to the other institutions, to then basically change the worldview of the majority. And again, this is a trend which I think you see to various degrees across the West. Luckily for the US, there are inherent protections that protects freedom in a way that there aren't in, say, Australia or the UK. And so it's much easier. In fact, actually, to answer much more simply, we don't have the same constitutional protections for freedom in the same way that, say, the US does. And therefore, it is easier for this sort of mentality to just go through the country much more quickly. If we had a First Amendment, I think things would be very different.
Yeah, it's interesting. Our cousins, the Australians, Canadians, and UK, pretty much all of that group are making pretty consistent inroads on limiting speech. Scotland and Ireland in the past year have both passed bills that criminalize hate speech, which is fucked. I'm not sure exactly where the UK stands on that. I know that their cops are showing up at people's houses for mean things people have said on the internet, which is not great. Canada passed C-16 back in the day, which was, you have to call somebody by their pronouns, otherwise I don't know what the fuck. And now they're trying to push another one that is supported by Trudeau's government and his left-leaning rivals, I guess, in government, if you want to call them rivals. C-63, which would criminalize all sorts of stuff. I mean, it would... Someone who said something mean enough could be fined up to $50,000, and $20,000 of that would go to the person they offended. Potentially, those are the high ends. And then if you said something egregious enough, like say wished death upon a group of people, or came out in support of a genocide or something, which like supporting it from the government's perspective, from the leftist government's perspective, might just be supporting Israel against Gaza, right? You could be sentenced to life in prison under C-63. So, and in Australia, obviously, we've talked about some of the stuff that they've done there. To me, there are two things that are different about the U.S. versus our cousins. One is the First Amendment, as you mentioned, and Canada doesn't even have a constitution; they have a Charter of Rights, which is not the same thing. And the second is guns. So it's hard to tell which one plays the biggest difference. I think I don't know that distinguishing between the two is useful, frankly, because I think one kind of supports the other. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on what's going on in the UK and Australia, especially since those are the places you live.
I have a little provocative experiment with people, and I basically say, "Oh, do you think it should be illegal to call someone the N-word?" And I would say most of the people I speak to in Australia or the UK, and by the way, most of the people who I would have spoken to in New York when I lived there would have said, yes, I think it is. And they just have this visceral, instant reaction that calling someone the N-word is really nasty, and therefore it should be illegal. I think a lot of people in their mind can't make the distinction between something is bad, something is morally inappropriate, but it can still and should still be legal, because making it illegal on balance would be worse for society and worse for people. And what this comes down to, and I think John Peterson said this, is we've forgotten how to argue for free speech on first principles. So we've, from the days of your John Stuart Mills and other great thinkers, we've forgotten how to make arguments for free speech and to say people should be allowed to say awful, nasty, outrageous, racist, terrible stuff, because if you do choose to make that illegal, there are worse consequences, like driving that stuff underground, like arbitrary policing of what is and isn't acceptable speech. So I think the right actually has a lot to answer for here. And again, I think, whilst the US does have protected speech, I think there is soft censorship of speech in the US that sits beneath the law, which is equally dangerous. Well, not as equally, which is dangerous. The right needs to remember how to argue for free speech again, because I think it's something which has been forgotten. And until we get that back, you're going to have more and more people who are just saying, well, we need to just kind of criminalize things which are nasty and bad, but should still be legal. Now, the Nazi salute is now illegal in Victoria. And again, it's a hard argument for people who, are basic thinkers to argue for the Nazi salute, because it's obviously like disgusting, but it's also something which absolutely should be legal. It is more dangerous to make that illegal than to legalize it. So I think it's a really, really scary position that we find ourselves in when it comes to speech.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to be able to argue from that perspective. I think accepting something as part of your epistemology without the ability to defend it can be very dangerous, right?
Explain that to me.
It's like if somebody were to Well, the way that I think about it is I spent time in the military, and then I did a lot of training of folks afterwards and educating of folks afterwards. And I think of a math teacher specifically, right? The reason that your high school, middle school math teacher made you show your work on math problems wasn't to be a dick and make you do superfluous work. It was to see in your process if there were errors, right? Process errors are really important. So if you can argue from the point of first principles with another person who's arguing a counterpoint from first principles, reasonable people should be able to find either subjective differences of opinion, which are going to go in different directions, and there's nothing we can do about that, so we've got to find a way to exist together. Or they can find objective realities in there that maybe they didn't know before, or maybe they convinced somebody else that they didn't know before. If you're not able to do that, then everybody is just basically communicating in Facebook memes. You know what I mean? And it's hollow, and you're never going to convince anybody of your side. You're never going to learn anything from their side, and we just get farther and farther apart.
I love the maths analogy. I think that's fantastic.
That's the easiest way for me to think about it. Now, I make the same argument about because I think it's a really good thought exercise to take things back to first principles. And I would add, and this may seem foreign to somebody from Australia who lives in the UK, but I use the same argument for the Second Amendment for gun ownership rights. And this is more often than not, I'm talking to conservative or libertarian people. So this is the argument that I make, that I try to give to them to use out in public. I think everybody, regardless of how pro-gun you are, can think of somebody right now who probably shouldn't own a gun, right? Somebody that's too crazy or too stupid. The question then becomes, how do we adjudicate this? What governing body, whether it's real or de facto, gets to decide who has that right and who doesn't? Because a right is something that you have, a privilege is something that can be taken away, right? So we don't call it the Second Amendment privilege, we call it the Second Amendment right. So who is it that gets to adjudicate that? And then you have thought experiments, you posit different answers to that question, and you take them all the way to their logical conclusion. If it is the government, then the government essentially has a monopoly on violence at that point. And we specifically set our country up so as not to let the government have a monopoly on violence, whether it's private citizens owning rifles or tanks. It doesn't matter, right? Like that is a very extreme situation, but when the government has a monopoly on violence, then they have a monopoly on speech as well. And that's something that we just cannot withstand. So that's the first half of the conversation. The second half is for the conservative to challenge themselves to figure out how we can better deal with this problem. Now, it's not going to just be about access to firearms. It might be something to do with how we invest in people's emotional and psychological health, right? There's a lot of ways to skin that particular cat. And for me, instead of taking the path of least resistance, I think we should take the path of best efficacy, right? What's going to produce the best results regardless of how much effort it takes. I mean, it should be worth the effort. If you want that thing, and this is the general premise of this show, is you can bitch about your rights all you want and wait around for somebody to secure them for you, and you're going to be a subject under their rule. Or you can secure them yourself by performing the responsibilities required of you, and that's what makes you a citizen. Effort and outcome, that's how it works. If you're not willing to put in the effort, then you're going to live with whatever outcome is handed to you, frankly. So that's the challenge, in my opinion, for pro-gun conservatives. What effort must we put forward to limit or at least mitigate the negative effects of gun ownership such that we can keep that right to ourselves and feel good about it?
That's the second thread to what you were just putting forward. And I want to go back to the first one quickly, because that argument around the government and the monopoly on violence is one that I can understand in the context of, having your musket ready when King Charles knocks on your door. How does that argument play out in a day and age when the American military's comparable force is so great that a community militia couldn't stand up to that force?
Could they not? I'm sure you've paid attention over the past 20 years to Iraq and Afghanistan, I'm sure you've heard of Vietnam before, right? Those are places with where some of them may have started with some level of equipment, was gone rapidly, right? Especially in Afghanistan, it never existed in the first place, and they fought us for 20 years to a stalemate. And Vietnam did the same over the course of 15 to 20 years. So I don't accept that premise. I mean, if you believe that the government's willing to use tactical nukes on communities, which, I mean, who knows, maybe it's possible, but nobody wants to be the king of a pile of rubble, right? And that is the benefit of an insurgency, because you know that they don't want to destroy infrastructure any more than they have to, right?
Yeah, that's fair. That makes sense. How much do you think that is that thinking around basically, because a lot of people think about guns and think about the right to keep your family safe, the right to protect yourself, the right to maintain a level of autonomy or power with respect to the government. Is that still core to the way that a lot of people think about the Second Amendment?
I would say on the conservative side, yeah. Frankly, I don't know how progressives feel about the Second Amendment. Like but the reason I say that is because they only seem to have emotional responses to it, and that's not a real response to me. You know what I mean? Like, I would have to watch this person go through the paces of learning the history of this and then applying it in sociological thought experiments to root out how they actually feel, because I feel like right now they're just parroting talking points that they've heard. Right. One of the chief ones that you hear in the United States right now is that for the first time in history, guns are the number one cause of death for children. Well, that's not true, right? It's ages 1 to 19, 18 and 19-year-olds, which make up the bulk of gang violence in America, is lumped into all of a sudden 0 to 17. Actually, 0 is taken out, so infant mortality is gone. So they just like slightly move the chart to the right a little bit and come up with this new data set that doesn't represent what they're trying to say. But people believe that shit, right? Because that's the only access to information they have there. So I don't know that most progressives have any kind of understanding of what it is. On the conservative side, I still hear arguments about like hunting and stuff like that. The Second Amendment is not for hunting. The Second Amendment is to protect ourselves against an invasive government. That's literally what it was designed for. So I don't know. I don't know how deep the knowledge of it runs, and it's a real problem, especially in our political class, because this is the case not just with the Second Amendment, but with the first principles more generally. The idea of Locke, the ideas are ideas from Locke, the ideas from the Preceptor, the ideas from I guess old school libertarianism, but English common law and stuff like that. People who are making decisions for our future have no understanding of our past. These people, they keep saying our democracy, don't seem to realize that there hasn't been a direct democracy on Earth anywhere except for some pirates, like for real, since the 4th century BC in Athens, Greece. Like, it just doesn't exist. It's not a thing at all. But they keep parroting these lines, and people are like, well, we have to protect democracy. I'm like, no, we don't, because it's not even a thing, It's a downstream function of a republic. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to ferret some of this stuff out. It's hard. It's like trying to teach base 10 math to somebody who grew up with like a base 6, for example, like in ancient Egypt or something like that, or a base 3. I think there was a base 3 back then too.
The progressive would say that the emotional response on the conservative side would be basically, saying Second Amendment, Second Amendment, Second Amendment at all costs, and not going through the types of considerations around standards for gun ownership, around sorts of the types of the efficacy question, which was your second prong there. Like there is that problem on the right as well, surely.
The standard for gun ownership is not an emotional one. It is that every human being has a right to defend themselves, both against aggressors, foreign or domestic, and then against their own government, right? That's not an emotional response, in my opinion. But people do get emotional about it. What I don't like are the conservative folks who just yell "shall not infringe" into other people's faces, which is a line from the Second Amendment. Like, no, I'm not willing to have a conversation about this because "shall not infringe." Well, that's not how you educate people. And maybe you say it's not my job to educate people, because that's something that the left likes to say quite a bit about their wild ideas on gender and sexuality and stupid shit like that. But it is your job to educate people. Like, as an American, as a doesn't matter what your nationality is, as a member of your culture and community, it is your job to be the best representation of your ideals and the ideals of your culture, and to espouse those to other people and accept them into it, right? When somebody's wrong and then they become right, treat them the same way that you were treated when you were wrong about something and then became right, and give them the information to do that. I think it was Abraham Lincoln who said, "If I've made a friend out of my enemy, have I not defeated him?"
Lovely line. Can I use that little nod to the gender and sexuality nonsense to segue a tad? Where do you think, when you think about the culture wars and the craziness around identity politics and all that stuff that we've seen over the last, well, the acceleration over the last 10 years, when you look at the US, do you think we are coming down the other side of that mountain? Are we past peak woke, or do you think that there is still battles that are yet to be fought?
Yeah, there's still battles, but I think some stuff that's happened recently is bringing the Overton window back to a little bit more normal. I think think of the boiling frog analogy, where the temperature starts low and it gets hotter and hotter, and the frog doesn't realize it's being boiled. Unfortunately, this, however you want to classify it, globalist, Marxist, whatever the fuck it is, has overplayed their hand quite a few times, right? They overplayed it during COVID with the regulations, and they've been found out too many times trying to build globalist alliances, like countries signing over their autonomy to the World Health Organization, for example, which is nonsense. People are uncomfortable with that. Even people in Europe who are used to something like an overarching governing body like the EU are very uncomfortable with that idea, especially after all the bullshit they pulled. And then they see things like, a lot of people on the far left are very comfortable with what happened during the Trump trial this summer. A lot of people are like, that something's fucked up here. You know what I mean? So yeah. I think they're overplaying their hand too much, and a lot of people are waking up to this. And then on the other side of that, on the, let's call it the enforcement side, and I'm talking about social enforcement, not legal. We've gone in a very short amount of time from saying the wrong thing about race or gender or sexuality or something like that, or even coming out in support of Trump, to where people are openly challenging these ideas now. And when somebody goes too far against the right side, like Jack Black and Kyle Gass the other day, for example, there's a backlash, and like, no, we don't do that stuff, right? And I don't think it's pro-right. I think it's like, hey, we're tired of this divisive bullshit. So I believe the Overton window is shifting back, and it might just be a function of people being exhausted with politics being all anybody ever fucking talks about.
Yeah, I think that's right. But the one concern that I have, and I bring this up whenever we have this conversation, is that, and I think this is the case in the US, I think it is particularly the case in Australia, the education system has been so effectively colonized by the left that I don't think any kid who goes into primary school and then finishes at the end a university degree could not do that and be somewhat indoctrinated, no matter how well-meaning or balanced they may be. So I'll give you a couple of examples from Australia. In Australia now, the welcome to country. Have you heard of this? The welcome to country ritual?
No, I've never heard of this.
So you probably would have it if there were more Native Americans in the US, but they were all largely wiped out, weren't they? We have the kind of Indigenous Aboriginal Australians, and there is now kind of this huge left-wing push on to lionize Indigenous Australians in our culture and all of the white guilt that goes along with the evils of the past. And one of the ways now that you have to prostrate yourself before the kind of woke gods is you have to do a welcome to country every morning as a school kid, which is basically the being, or an acknowledgement of country, saying that we acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And it gets longer and longer every year. So they do it before every football game now. And sometimes you feel like the acknowledgement takes longer than the first half. Kids have to do that, and they basically feel like that's normal from the age of 5 all the way through to 18 when they finish school. They get in history classes this black armband view of history, which basically says that all the white people were evil and colonizers, and all of the good things of our history are slowly just pushed to one side. And I think this is, and then you get into university and you can see all the nutters, kind of on campus and all the stuff that happens there. I think this is a battle which, unfortunately, we're going to be fighting in 30, 40 years' time, because every kid that comes out of that is going to need to be brainwashed in some way. And until the right works harder to take control of curriculums and works harder to push back in education, we're screwed. Because the left, whenever they hold the levers of power, they work hard to basically push and change curriculums. They work hard to change the education culture. And when the right's in, at least in Australia or the UK, it's this laissez-faire, she'll be right, it'll all work itself out mentality. And that really needs to change.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I know. What are you seeing in the US?
Not that. I mean, so what you're describing, by the way, is a Maoist struggle session. I mean, it went on during the Cultural Revolution for decades. And it does. We would, I guess, the way that Westerners or American Westerners would think of it is re-education camp. I think that's a phrase that people would agree with. But now
I don't think that's going too far.
No, now you've institutionalized the re-education camp into a little bit every single day, which again goes back to the boiling frog analogy. You're poisoning someone's mind over the course of time. They're trying to do it in American education for sure. And America, to be clear, American education was fucked up way before the Marxists got a hold of it. It was American primary education system was revamped in the early part of the 20th century by Henry Ford and John Rockefeller, essentially to produce compliant workers. Right? I mean, if you think about what it is to be a good student, you're quiet, you do your work, you don't misbehave, you don't ask, or you're not disruptive. Right? All the things that are, I guess. Like some of those things are good. It's good there's some grading element to it for sure that's important, I think, to test your knowledge and shit like that. But I don't think being compliant is something that we should train into people as a matter of course. But it does, like, cui bono, right? Who benefits from something is a good question to always ask yourself. And the only people that benefit from compliance are people who want to fucking dominate other people, right? And who want to control them. So I think that's a big problem. Now, seeing as working the independence out of somebody over the course of 12 years of primary education was already systemic in America, or endemic rather, to our education system, I think it was very easy for Marxists to slide in there and slowly add little bits that chip away at cultural pride, like historical appreciation and stuff like that. And like the 1619 Project, which is, America actually started when the first slave got here. Like, okay, that's a weird fucking measure to decide when the country started, because we didn't have a constitution for 150 years after that. Yeah, that certainly happens here. I think it came a little bit later. But the Bolshevik Marxist nonsense showed up here sometime in the early part of the 20th century as well. And it started working its way into the university system first. And then it kind of made its way down through primary education. Luckily, people are paying attention now. Catholic moms will protest from time to time and get called domestic terrorists by the federal government and shit like that. Yeah. But people laugh them out of the room. And to be frank, the reason that Glenn Youngkin is the governor of Virginia right now is simply because of that issue. Not that he isn't a good politician in other regards, but the reason he won is because people were tired of others trying to fucking mess with their children. Now, California just passed a bill this week that makes it California just shot down a bill that would have required teachers to not keep secrets from parents. That is to say, if a child starts changing their clothes and dressing like a girl at school, right now, California, it's legal for the teacher not to report that to the parent. not to report
Yeah.
mental illness to a parent, right? Which is insane to me. So yeah, there's still it exists in some places, but there's quite a bit of pushback.
There's, I think when you think about the tertiary education sector, I think there's a really interesting debate on the right in America at the moment. And I've spoken about this with Peter Boghossian,
Mm.
Neil Ferguson, Winston Marshall, a lot of the guys who are behind the University of Austin and establishing that. And basically, they're saying, look, we all concede that the tertiary sector has been just consumed by this DEI woke dogma. How do we respond to it? And you have on one side the Chris Rufos of this world
Mm.
who are saying we need to reform the existing institutions by going in, targeting DEI advocates and stripping them out. And then on the other side, you have people like Peter Boghossian saying these institutions are too far gone. We think that there is just little point in trying to reform them. They're done. We need to start building anew. And the University of Austin is kind of the beachhead for that movement. I think it's a really interesting conversation. And I don't think there's a settled answer on the right at the moment, whether you try and reform education or whether you just say, look, you need to just build new institutions. And I guess on the primary or the parent side, the equivalent would be you basically just say homeschool your kids, for example.
Yeah, I mean, there's another guy, Corey DeAngelis. I don't know if you're familiar with him
Yeah.
in the U.S. who's working on school choice nationally, right? And it's essentially a free market mapped onto education, right? So instead of ensuring that the money goes to the public school, make the money available to any school, and then because he'll ask the question kind of tongue in cheek, well, if people can take their kid from public school and go to a private school, why should public schools be worried about that, right? And it's because they produce an inferior product, right? But the public school still has the ability to produce a commensurate or superior product even, and keep people in public schools. Which is they should. You should have to compete for somebody's business. You shouldn't just be awarded somebody's business because we're not fucking socialists here. So I think it's a really good idea to have something like that. I don't know that I just don't know that we're such a big society. Throwing out an entire institution like that all of a sudden just causes too many chaotic ripples. I think it's quite a bit easier to deconstruct something over time or reshape it than it is to throw it out entirely. You know what I mean? Although I do support people taking, if I am to have kids, if I have kids, I'm definitely not going to send them to any school, public or private. They'll be learning from me until until they're a little bit older at least.
How do you like? I understand that, but how do you then think about, say, the downside of losing the social education that comes with school and having to deal with bullies and having to relate to girls and boys and all
Sure.
that sort of stuff that you can't just deliver to the same extent with homeschooling?
Yeah, well, I mean, so the way that people, even when I was growing up, I saw this quite a bit. The way people deal with it is by social pods. So let's say you live like if you're like in a very rural area, it might be more difficult to do this. But the people that I knew that were homeschooled in middle and high school, there would be somewhere between 5 and 10 families in a neighborhood, and all the kids were homeschooled, and they took turns getting lessons from different homes, right? So it would end up being somewhere between 15 and 25 kids, basically, which is a normal class size, right, in a private school. So you don't really miss out on all that stuff. I think the rub is in some of the institutional benefits. Like if you are in a rural area, there's no public transportation coming to pick you up and shit like that to take you to somebody else's house, so the parent has to provide for that. And then, of course, there's after-school activities like sports and clubs and all that bullshit that you have to account for. It's I guess you have to ask yourself, is the juice worth the squeeze? And again, it's this effort and outcome thing. You're right to ask that question. If you take your kid out of that social situation, and when I say social situation, I don't mean just being around other kids, but being unsupervised around other kids to do what you said, to learn low-level conflict resolution is really important. So if you're just sitting in mom's living room all the time and Johnny and Jimmy don't ever get into a fight, that's a problem. Like, they need to get into a fight when they're 10, 11, 12 years old, so they don't get into fights when they're 25 years old, right?
I think this is not just a homeschooling issue. I think what you're seeing today across the West is you're seeing a generation of kids that are less resilient, perhaps, than generations in the past. And the culture that I think, again, is a Western trend of basically mollycoddling. Is that a US term, mollycoddling?
I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
Oh, mollycoddling? Mollycoddling kids, not allowing them on the monkey bars or, going, I think, too far in the other direction with anti bullying policies. I think there's a real crisis of resilience amongst young people. And I think, in turn, that also plays into accelerating the identity politics thing because it brands itself as being so kind and compassionate, which is appealing to someone who doesn't have a natural resilience to them. I think it's something which we don't talk enough about is how we actually engendering resilience amongst young people.
Yeah, but Goshen talks about that a lot, for sure. So does Schellenberger talks about that. Jonathan Haidt talks about it a lot. I mean, there's a lot of people out there. And the coddling of the American mind, they talk about kind of reversing cognitive behavioral therapy, right? Which is to say you're unbuilding resilience. Why would you do that? That's like intent. Anti-bullying campaigns are exactly as if you were to intentionally weaken somebody's immune system. Like you wouldn't even consider doing that. That's stupid. Well, I guess COVID shots kind of did that, to be honest. But like you wouldn't. A reasonable person wouldn't sit down and say, you know what we're going to do? We're going to make this person less resilient. So that's why even back to that gun conversation with progressives, their emotional decisions are being made that don't make any sense, right? And I think that's why I think it's imperative for conservatives that have actual testosterone in their body to be calm and have conversations with people and tamp down the emotional part of it a little bit, because somebody's got to be the adult in the room, right? And frankly, somebody with low T is not going to be the adult if it's a man, especially because they're going to be emotional, and they're not meant to be. They're not biologically designed to be emotional like that, so they don't do it well. You know what I mean? And it typically leads to some kind of violence, frankly, which is what you see from Antifa and school shooters and shit like that.
Yeah, well, I think that's one strand. And the other strand, which leads to that sort of violence, is the successful characterization of words as violence on the left has done so much damage to public discourse. Because if you say to someone that words are violence, then it's a very easy way to legitimize actual violence. And it's no coincidence that most of the political violence in society today comes from the left, not the right, because they see it as legitimate in the pursuit of resisting actual or violence in the form of words, which are comparable. It's a problem.
Yeah, it's a big problem. I mean, we just saw it, not to project politics onto this, but we just saw an attempt on the former president's life. And, maybe there's something more nefarious behind it. I don't see any evidence that he had foreign handlers or anything like that. And I don't see any evidence that he had domestic handlers either, frankly, like that somebody's trying to target. I think there's a level of incompetence that implies malfeasance, and that's a whole different show. But just some guy, like, think about it this way. A crazy person on the right or left, somebody who is emotionally unstable, will hear words of violence or phrases like stochastic terrorism and stuff like that, and maybe they get tuned up and decide to go do real violence against the opposite party. Somebody who's black pilled, one of these people that just like have tuned out of the process and they hate everything. I mean, it's essentially nihilism, political nihilism, right? They're going to target anybody they can find. So now you've got like the most difficult thing to defend against. And I've done this work before, executive protection work, bodyguard work, whatever you want to call it, is the lone wolf attacker, right? Because typically in an investigation, particularly in a prophylaxis state, you're trying to identify a threat before it happens and build resilience against it. The lone wolf has such a small footprint, right, that it's very difficult to determine who they are and where they might come from. Now there's a whole class of people, this incel group, these people who are like they're picture on Twitter as Pepe the Frog or whatever, and they think the Jews run the whole world or whatever the fuck, stupid shit like that. They are that is a very dangerous group of people because they're all emotional and weak, and they have no base, they have no epistemological base, and they're very susceptible to rhetoric like that. And when this is who I think this guy is, in my opinion, the shooter. If I think it will be proven that that's the archetype that he is. When the media class and the political class spend 8 years saying that somebody's Hitler, that they're Mussolini, that if he wins this election, if he's allowed to win this election, then the America will end, right? If people, and look, they can say whatever they want. It's a free country, but if that's the message constantly put forward, and in addition to what you said, words are actual violence, then yes, people are going to fucking take shots at politicians. That's just the way it's going to be. And frankly, I'm not a big fan of politicians, but I'm not a fan of political violence, even less.
Yeah, I agree. I think the other thing, when you look at a guy like that, they all look the same, don't they? They always have the shitty long hair
Weak
and
chin.
the acne, and yeah, it's you can imagine it in your head before you see the
Yeah.
photo, and it's
I mean,
pretty spot
yeah,
on.
kind of tongue in cheek every now and again will say like maybe the qualification to own a gun should be the ability to get laid. You know what I mean? Like, if you're a man and you can't convince a woman to sleep with you, you probably shouldn't own a gun.
I think that's a pretty that's a good first criteria for look, the thing is there is a crisis in modern masculinity, particularly amongst young men. And if this is probably one of the top 3 or 4 themes that emerges on my podcast, and that is we live in an age where religiosity is declining. It's declining rapidly in Australia and the UK. It's still declining in the US, but a bit more slowly. Where traditional masculinity is seen as toxic, and you have this notion of toxic masculinity. And as a result of this, I think you've got this whole subgroup of young men who don't have the traditional moorings of masculinity, religion. Add in, they don't have the traditional moorings of community a lot of the time, with, say, working from home or being in online communities. And so I think there has to be this conversation, like, for young kids, if you don't believe in a God, which, some people can't bring themselves to get to that point, what are the foundational principles which moor you to something so you don't go out and jump onto a roof and take pot shots at a president?
Yeah.
And I think that's a big thing that Western society needs to grapple with. And I don't think I'm hearing a huge amount of compelling answers at the moment.
Well, I think Western society's become extremely myopic, you know what I mean, with peaceful transfers of power. Now, again, this is another scenario where there are good and bad things to anything. We had monarchs or oligarchs for a very long time. They maintained power throughout their lives and then transferred it to a relative for a very long time in human history. Whether it were feudal governors or kings or emperors or whatever it was, it's happened quite a bit. And now we have a peaceful transfer of power, which means that the Overton window shifts quite rapidly and often. And it's a big problem, right? Because long-term projects don't get done. And here are some examples of how that's not happened. One is here in the U.S., the 1997 crime bill, which established like mandatory minimums. It differentiated between crack and powder cocaine. Basically was designed to get violent gang members off the streets. Fair enough, right? I mean, that's a fucking good idea to do that, right? There are 2 more good ideas that should have come after that, but never did. One is to look for fallout. What was the fallout? Well, the fallout we now know was that we have a bunch of kids at home with single moms and no dads, right? All throughout black and brown communities, particularly in inner cities. And for the first time in human history, the number one predictor of criminal activity went from poverty to fatherless homes, right? Over the course of about 5 years. It was very rapid. So we did absolutely jack shit. We didn't spend one goddamn dollar on that particular problem. I don't know that anybody even thought about it other than to whine about it in the political sphere. The second thing we didn't do is to challenge the idea of parallel economies. And this happens all the time. It happened for different reasons too. When the Roman currency started to tank back in the day, Diocletian instituted price caps on everything in Roman culture, and people just created a black market. It happens all the time, right? It happens when people don't feel connected to society and culture, if they feel disenfranchised right? From the culture they're in, the community they're in. There's many reasons that it happened, and the only solution to it is to integrate those people into the institutional economy that exists already. Otherwise, they will maintain a parallel economy, and not one goddamn person even tried to do that on the right or the left throughout that whole process. So, and one of the reasons is because Democrats are in power, and then they do something with the intent of following it up with this other thing. So phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Phase 2 and 3 very rarely get done because then somebody else takes power. And this is something that the West, like if you want to purchase the peaceful transfer of power from time to time, if that's what you genuinely want, then you have to start accounting for this, or we're going to be in a rapid spiral down where we're never going to, like, culture will change rapidly. We'll have constant chaos. It doesn't make sense, right? The pendulum swings too far back and forth the other way, and we never reach any kind of balance.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember who it was. It was Dave Rubin speaking to, I think, Jonathan Haidt, may be wrong. But anyway, basically said society is now changing so rapidly. There are these epochal shifts every decade, and then we move on to the next epochal shift, and we don't actually ever see what the outcomes were of the previous shift before we actually then move forward. That word fallout, I haven't heard in that context, and I think it's such a good one. And I think it's such a feature of modern politics is that we don't think of second order or unintended consequences. COVID being the classic example where if you say, we're going to institute lockdowns, no one actually stopped to think about the second order consequences in terms of the stunting of children's growth or domestic violence rates or all sorts of consequences that could flow from a policy like that. You just had one high level number being a fatality number or a daily COVID number, and that was enough to dictate policy. I just wonder if there's some sort of a way for politicians to get better at thinking through what are the flow-on effects of decisions as opposed to just, well, to use your term, what is the fallout? Because it's a real problem.
Yeah. And I don't know, like, we've become very romantic about the idea of a constitutional republic, and good for us, I guess. We've become very romantic about transfers of power from time to time, on a regular basis. I'm not so sure we should just settle, right, and think that we've got it all figured out. America's still a relatively young country, and things change quite a bit. I mean, so the UK has, in the last 150 years, gone from a monarchy to a constitutional parliamentary monarchy, which is quite a bit different, right? That's a pretty rapid change for the monarch. The monarchical power to essentially dissolve, right, to an advisory role, and then allow for a parliamentary system to develop. Evolve or die, I guess, is a phrase that I would think of. And I'm not convinced that the way that we do business right now is the best way to do it, right? It's not to say that we should again institute rapid change because we see how that works, but we should be willing to experiment a little bit, because the founders laid the pathway. They wrote a constitution, and within a decade or so, amended it 10 times. You know what I mean? Which people say that the Constitution is should be. They are constitutional originalists. Well, the founders weren't because they amended it 10 times, right? So I'm not sure how you can really make that argument, frankly. Now, you have to be able to adjust with time and maintain first principles, as you said before. The problem is these people that are involved in government do not even understand first principles, and they're not going to. They're not going to understand first principles unless the people understand them and make them understand it, right? That's the only way that works. Power is generated from the bottom up.
Well, the thing is, you've got to encourage politicians to maintain first principles, but then adapt and experiment and change the ways in which you go about achieving the outcomes from those principles. And I think at the moment, what we have is that we're probably too easy on some politicians who lack principles, and we're too hard on some politicians who change particular policy settings in order to try and achieve an outcome. And I think that sort of experimentation mentality that the founders of the US had was fantastic. It's easy at someone who's not American to forget how young most of those guys were. I read a really kind of slightly wanky article which was trying to equate the founders of America to, tech kind of agile technology strategists and in the way that they approach their work. And there's a lot to be said for that. But at the moment, I think, we equate any sort of change in policy settings from a politician as flip flopping, and that's why they're generally pretty reluctant to go about doing so.
Yeah, I mean, it probably should speak to someone's character that they evolve with new evidence, because otherwise you're a fucking idiot, frankly, right? But that is a function of, again, I think this stuff happens from the ground up. The individual person is highly critical of someone who changes, like in their own life, right? And the way that I always explain this to people is that everything that you know now and you're correct about, you were wrong about or ignorant about, all the way up until the point that you were right about it. And that's how learning things works, right? And that's how learning things works for everyone, forever. Every human being that's ever walked the face of the earth, unless they've had a novel mathematical or engineering or scientific breakthrough, right? That person has come to the correct state from an incorrect state, whether it was ignorance or just being flat wrong. It's like, maybe we should see that process in the same way that we see like a physical glow up, as people like to call it, where somebody's fat and out of shape and they get in shape. And you're like, oh, good for you, buddy. Nobody criticizes that guy. Nobody says when a dude's walking around at 280 pounds and he goes down to like 205 and he looks good with his shirt off now, people don't go like, you know what, that guy's a real flip flopper. You know what I mean? That would be a retarded thing to say. But for some reason, we project that onto to our social beliefs. I just don't understand it.
I've never heard you explain that before. I really like that. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah. So, running out of time here, I want to talk about the show. Tell me about Fire at Will. It's not about shooting at you, I hope.
Yeah, we probably need to revisit that name in the space of what's happened in the last week or two.
Yeah, well,
in the
even
interest of my personal safety.
With that, the crossbow dude running around fucking London right now too.
Yeah, that's
Jesus
right.
Christ.
Look, I'll take my chances.
Yeah.
We say it's a safe space for dangerous conversations, and I think there's a lot of similarity with what you're trying to do, Dan. In that, over the last 10 or 15 years, I think a lot of not even right wing people, moderate people, have been cowered into silence for perspectives that used to be quite moderate. But also, I think we've forgotten that the best way to seek truth is through debate and inquiry. And so my idea is actually to bring those types of ideas out into the open and to discuss them honestly and openly, and to bring dangerous ideas to the surface. And we talk about that with politicians and cultural figures and academics and all that sort of good stuff. And I think the good thing is this is part of a growing movement. You look at the trigonometry guys in the UK, you look at a lot of, I think, similar-ish types of podcasts where there is a resistance to this sort of groupthink, cancel culture mentality that we saw in the 2010s. And, long may it continue. Everyone, I would strongly recommend checks it out. We had a great conversation with Sir Neil Ferguson, came out a couple of days ago. It's a cracker to start with.
Yeah. Give me an example of something recently you got that you've, like a guest you've had on the show, I guess, or whatever, a topic that was controversial that you kind of worked your way through. So what I'm looking for is something that maybe you and the guest disagreed on that you kind of worked through, if that was a thing.
Let's take the conversation with Neil Ferguson. So
Okay.
He's come out with a pretty provocative argument where he says that he has said since 2018 that the US is in Cold War II with China. He's come out with a pretty provocative argument recently where he's revised his thesis, and he said, I think the US is now closer to being the Soviets in this analogy than they are to being the Americans in the original. And he said, you look at the deaths in despair that are happening across middle America with things like fentanyl. You look at life expectancy decreasing. You look at woke ideology infiltrating the institutions in the same way that the workers' paradise ideology ran through the Soviets, but the common people not believing in that ideology and there being a disconnect. You look at some of the economic measures. You look at the military being overstretched. And he basically goes through a series of quite compelling arguments to why that is the case. Now, look, I struggled to get on board with that because I looked at this from a moral perspective, and I looked at the moral foundations of the US being fundamentally different to the Soviet Union. I think where he took me to by the end is to say, well, yeah, that's all well and good, but we're not talking enough about the fundamental similarity, which is these were two systems where they were set up, and there is now this huge alienation with large parts of the population from the founding ideals of that system. And you've got a ruling class that's very happy to go along with that, and then disenchantment for a majority. And and he got me to a point where I went, yeah, like the Americans aren't communists, but they sure as hell have a huge part of their population that are disenfranchised, that are, drugging and drinking themselves to death because they don't believe in the founding mission of America anymore. And I think that's something which all Americans need to think very carefully about. And certainly isn't happening in New York or in the Hamptons or in Aspen. So it needs to start happening from the ground up through podcasts like this.
Well, I mean, ironically, the Trump selection for vice president, J.D. Vance, lived that life, right? And worked his way out of it. And I think Bhatia talks about this a lot, about the left's losing the culture war with the working class in America and how they've gravitated towards the right. And I think that is probably the thing that most makes Vance, or that most made Vance the pick. I think that's probably the reason,
Absolutely.
More than anything else. Well, look, it's a great conversation. The show sounds great. I'm definitely going to check out that show with Ferguson. I want to see if he can convince me to. Tell everybody where they can find you on the interwebs.
We will add the links in the show notes. So I'm speaking on behalf of your producer,
Yep.
but the podcast is Fire at Will on all the major podcast platforms as well as on YouTube.
Sweet. And you're a good Twitter follow as well. Informative, sometimes funny. Talk a little shit. It's fun. Thanks for coming today. I really appreciate the conversation.
Thanks, Dan. Keep up the good work, mate.
Yeah, man. We'll see you soon. And thank you all for listening. This has been Citizen.